As introduced, I am Mike from the American Pasture Poultry Producers Association. We are a trade association. Our members are primarily independent pasture-raised farmers who direct market their products. Often they're multi-species, multi-enterprise on the farm, and pastured poultry fits into that in some way, whether it's their primary thing or whether it's just kind of a value-added thing. And as you saw with Mike earlier and Leone previously, the pastured space, this segment of farm really spans a lot of diversity in terms of how people approach it, the birds they use, and even housing and things like that. And so there's a lot of thoughts out there about what it is. Today I wanted to kind of just take a look, not necessarily dive deep into a welfare kind of presentation. I think holistically, welfare plays into this idea of welfare and sustainability. Looks at the poultry, of course, but it also has to factor in, the farmer and the community and the ecosystem. And that's kind of where I see the intersection of, the pastured poultry as we advocate for as an association, kind of fitting into that metric there, that matrix of, how does the birds bring to life a farm, a community, and the ecosystem, the pasture itself. And so we'll cover a little bit of ground here today. We're going to end up talking about the new pastured poultry standard that we collaborated on and has just been formally released by American Grass Fed Association. They administer the standards, but we collaborated on creating it. And so we're going to get to that point about what our take is. But in order to get there, we have to kind of take a little bit of a detour, and we have to kind of you know distinguish this idea of pasture raised and free range. And this is a very topical idea because USDA FSIS just recently closed their comment period as of 2 days ago on their current label guidelines or the proposed label guidance that actually does distinguish free range and pasture raised. And so we'll get to all of that in due time. I want to just kind of move through the idea because in a symposium like this, I get the idea, I get the sense, it's my gut that says sometimes when we have these conversations about different production systems, it helps to know what you're talking about, and it helps to know um, a the perspective of the people you're talking to. And so when it comes to pasture raised, that's the perspective I want to share. As we go through here, we're going to share lots of pictures, lots of maybe even some current contrasting ideas. It's not necessarily to say that one thing is worse than the other or better than the other. It's just different, right? So we have to think about things that are different because it means something when we talk about them. And so that's where we'll begin. Um, and so here, short overview of where we're going to go. We're going to look at a little history, kind of look at the problems that we see. So history-wise, the community of pastured poultry, where we're at today, started somewhere, and uh, that somewhere happened back in the 60s by a man named Joel, who, as a youngster, was raising these birds in portable coops. And I shared the quote here because we just have to realize that the way that we talk about pasture poultry in our farming community now really stems from this man and this idea. It's grown, it's adapted, it's moved, it's done a lot of different things, but it really kind of is popular because of him. And so the quote here is generally saying that in the late 60s, he started with these portable coops. It works then, it works now, he says in his classic way. Um, in the early 90s, then he starts to publish materials about this model, and it's really attractive to the independent farms who um, are looking for ways to really diversify their income, their business, and work within um, the current agricultural system without, not necessarily being a contract grower for another poultry company, for example. Kind of taking things into their own hands, really. Um, and then 97 is when APA really first kind of gets off the ground. We published our first magazine. It's a newsletter at the time, um, and kind of the we had breath in our lungs, so to speak. And I was not around at that time, so I'm looking back at this with a historical perspective. But and then we became an association soon after that. Um, we a whole lot of things happened. You know, the community grew, the idea grew, the market grew. 2017, we we hosted our first conference. We called it a professional pasture poultry conference, and we wanted our members who were making an income, you know, kind of business-minded producers, more so than the typical backyard or the typical hobby type of farmer or the homesteader, quote unquote, right? So we want those people, and that remains our focus today, even though we attract a lot of different people. Our focus is on the business side of a pastured poultry farm and helping and advocating for that to happen. We love it when everybody raises their own birds, but as an association, we really focus in on that business side of it. And then we're going to be entering our ninth annual conference, which will be held in January in Allen, Texas. And so 2024, the other milestone here is AGA publishes the pastured poultry for a couple years in um, collaboration with APA, with us and our board, and just putting something together that we thought reflected the historical reality of pastured poultry and set it apart from some of the competing options that you have in this space now in terms of whether it's a welfare certification or other label claim. And so I think we need to kind of really, this is important because like any movement that matures, any technology, any idea, any cultural shift, when it first starts, it has a very defined idea. There's things that happen, everybody kind of agrees, but as it matures, you know, it spreads out. More people put their own spin on what things are, and sometimes that works, and sometimes it causes some other challenges. And so, just having a representation of where we've come from is is important. And so, we look at this idea of portable from the beginning, and why was it portable from the beginning? Um, there's some challenges that we recognize that happen with chickens, right? You give chickens access to the outside enough and put enough of them out there, and you have that classic chicken yard. It's just a big old chunk of manure. When it rains, it's muddy. When it's dry, it's dusty, and it's I don't think any one of us would argue that that's good for anyone's welfare. You can let birds just range about the barnyard, and you know that if you have a few birds in your backyard, that probably works. You know, there's a point at which we think that that idea of just ranging throughout the barnyard doesn't work. Um, but you have a couple dozen or a couple dozen birds, you can probably do it. Uh, so it's common then you might be tempted to leave your birds in on a larger area for an extended grazing period, but that really also kind of tends to lead to the degradation of the pasture. Um, Again, really negative impacts on the pasture immediately, but then that could have long-term health impacts on the bird itself. Um, and chickens, of course, another challenge is if you've ever had chickens, you know um, that they're not easy to herd. So if you want to do high density short term grazing, then you have a challenge in herding them. Ducks, obviously, ducks and turkeys are good poultry to herd. Chickens are not. And so the answer here, or in the early days, was this idea of a floorless portable coop. Now, we don't, in it's probably a little bit later here that we get to it, but the idea of floorless portable is really the idea that APA kind of hangs its hat on. We floorless is not really critically important, but it does play into the type of shelter that you might use. So you do see a lot of floorless coops, but you see lots with floors in too. Portability is the main thing. And so here we have some great pictures. You can start to see some diversity of pastured farms in representative of scale here in these pictures. Um, you know, top two being primarily layers, bottom two being meat birds. The bottom left there is a larger scale farm using these are daily moved shelters. I think those are probably 400 to 600 birds each one. Then you got some adorable little Cornish cross meatballs ranging around here in the bottom right side. They're in the day range model. Um, top top left corner, you got the uh, someone moving a shelter. This is a really kind of a high tech pasture shelter, but that's got this one in particular probably has about 400, but people run them a little bit higher. So you have all these different models, and the essence of why you want to use a portable shelter or why we would advocate for a portable shelter um, over most other kind of range options is because they're easy to move. You can cover your entire pasture, and you have an opportunity to reduce your disease exposure, you know, specifically like parasites, and because you're constantly moving birds, right? You you move birds from today where their manure is to tomorrow or the next day to where their manure isn't, and you separate them from that manure. And so they're moving to fresh grass, if you could say. So this, but you're limiting the impact also of that grazing period. So you're minimizing and managing for the pasture impact and health as well. And so portable, there's also it's low housing, an opportunity to reduce stress. And these birds or these shelters right now, and really kind of started back in the early 90s. It was very common to be like a 50, 75 bird per shelter. That's still very common today, but you also find a lot of middle ground. But you also find on the large end of this spectrum, 6,000 bird shelters that have more automation in them and that are moved every single day. Um, and so it's really quite a fascinating evolution of the pastured model, and from 30 years ago when Apple kind of took root to now, and it's cool to see the housing innovations are really spectacular. That the shelter we're looking at there, the one on running gear up in the top left, hit the market, I don't know, probably 5, 6 years ago, and kind of really moved moved that idea of what's possible in a mobile coop forward. And it continues to grow. Dr. Rothrock mentioned using Chictopia, which is another automated smaller coop. And so it's only a matter of time before some of these things become more mainstream and more cost effective, really is one of the big challenges there when you talk about the the challenges of housing. And so we're gonna fast forward from those earlier kind of beginnings now and kind of just take a look at, you know, till we get to the modern point in time. And so I already talked about this big innovation in coops. Um, One of the things that has really helped the pasture poultry model grow is the idea of on-farm and exempt processing, which is a federally regulated thing. You might hear the phrase PL 9492. That's where the exemptions under the Poultry Products Inspection Act live. But that essentially there's a bunch of them, but in general, that allows farms to raise birds and then process them on their farm and then sell them in various contexts. Now, states can manipulate that and make it more restrictive and put up lots of obstacles to that, but federally, um, that's available in it. And so that's really been when we look at the early 90s, talking about Joel putting this model out there, reason it was able to take root is because of things like PL 94, 92, giving a legal basis for farms to do this and put those birds into the community members' hands, um, who wanted it, right? There's a segment of people who want that. And so that really helped build the farmers, build the consumers, and and then as we go along, consumers start to come back to the farms with their own requests and things like maybe they want soy free or maybe they want coin free, and we can argue and debate the merits of all of that. And it's a very good conversation to have. But the reality is consumers have demands or they have wants. And the idea is as a smaller, more adaptable farm, you can meet those demands. And so the soy free movement has been really popular within pasture poultry for, I don't know, since I've really been with APA, and that's been about 15 years. So, and it just continues to get more prevalent. But our farms, our members, our community was really serving that demographic when no other larger company was really giving it any time of day. And they still aren't really. There's a couple regional players, I think, that you can find some niche feeding strategies for their chickens and stuff. But really, so what happens through this period in the late 90s into that early 2000s is the market's really growing. Like the awareness is growing. I would say the awareness is growing more than the market is actually. It's still at this time, pasture poultry is fractions of a percent of market share. And I don't know if we're quite still even to a percent. So it's the awareness of pastured is very high, very, very visible. And that draws a lot of people into the market, into the opportunity. And then that's where you start to see all these ideas of the where pasture poultry started. You see the the approach watered down, or the ideals, the principles kind of, flatten a little bit to bring in a broader pool of people and and who can capitalize on market opportunities in different ways than, an independent farm could do. And so those are that's kind of the filling that gap there. We come into 2017, and I mentioned our first APA conference. Um, One of the very clear takeaways from some of our most experienced farmers, our most experienced community members, was that pasture raised had a greenwashing problem in the marketplace. Like there was considerable pressure in retail markets, that just there was people claiming pasture raised on their label that didn't match the idea of what they were doing, right? The historical idea of what pasture raised meant. And you would see it oftentimes in just the way they talked about their product, the way they actually did it. Because we have to pasture raised is a claim. It's a claim that can be marketed, but it's also a claim that describes how birds are raised. And so it really becomes important for consumers who are searching for pasture raised that they actually have an idea of what they're looking for. And if they only read the label, they can stand a really high likelihood of being misled. They might not get what they want, or what they're looking for. And that's the challenge that we have. And so these pictures I have up here is, I would argue that the center picture there, that's a farm down in Texas. They got some Cornish cross in a movable shelter. This is pretty similar to what people might expect. Maybe the one here on the left with that bird sitting there in that nice lush pasture. Um, but the picture on the right, I didn't blur this image out. This is actually blurred. I took it out of a video, a commercial, a public commercial on YouTube. And this is also the one on the right is marketed as a free range. I'm not sorry, marketed as a pasture raised farm. Um, and they're marketed as a pasture raised farm. And you clearly see that this is a barn, has a couple doors in there in the section that you can see. And the blurry part there is the dirt. So there's some birds out on there in that pasture, and they're doing a photo shoot. So there's definitely going to be birds on the pasture, right? Because there's a farmer in the foreground holding a chicken, talking about the benefits of this company and the eggs and stuff, and which is all great and well and good. Like there's no problem with that. But if you were to look at these two pictures side by side, the one here in the middle with David and his two boys walking along the chicken house, and then this one on the right where you have a pasture raised claim in this environment. They just don't look the same, right? The eyeballs are not deceiving you here, and so customers see that too. And that's the challenge when we say there's a greenwashing problem. So APA has been very steadfast over the years that pasture raised means something, and it can be different. We acknowledge that, but we have to kind of agree on what maybe that is, and at least create room to have something of a that is a level up from some of these other mainstream challenges. Right. And so this brings us to this really the one of the first well, a big challenge, a big obstacle here with FSIS. 2019, it was I think December of 19, and so the comment period was in 2020. FSIS published a label guideline that said basically all that text there basically says F, free range and pasture raised are synonymous. And if you're a casual observer, you're just kind of somebody thinking through life, and you already have this image of what free range means because free range has historically been marketed as like you see in this picture. This is another commercial. Um, there's actually quite a few of these birds on this pasture, but what you don't see on the left side there is there's another house opposite of this. So this is a shared yard between the house and um, if all of the birds in that house were on this little pasture for any amount of time, there wouldn't be much of that green stuff there. And so, um, but this is kind of playing into that image of what consumers think about when they think about free range. And if you say, "Oh, free range and pasture raised are synonymous," you see the problem that we're going for here. And this is not really a free range house model that I've seen too much of in my travels and observations. Usually, you don't see these broiler houses um, with any of these chickens outside of it, which is the dirty secret of the label, right? Free range is really that kind of no man's land of poultry raising claims. Um, Continuous access to the outdoors just doesn't mean a lot if the door doesn't actually open. And then if the door opens, we've seen some behavioral stuff from in Leone's previous uh, talk that you know chickens can sometimes be afraid. They can be fearful and they can be worried about these different environments and they're preying. So there's some challenges there. Then opening the door just isn't always enough to get birds to have to utilize this pasture. And so that's the challenges we find ourselves with. And this creates those misleading associations with this picture is not one of those misleading pictures. These are actual pasture raised hens in the early spring. Um, Actually, I think this might be, yeah, I'm not sure timeline. It might be later spring. But anyway, this is a farm in Pennsylvania. Like I said, a few hundred layers in here. They're coming out to pasture in the morning. And so But we get the challenge because pasture raised now has got to a point where it's demanding a higher market share, a premium price point in the market. And as you get some of these other companies that might trade pasture for access, access, my birds have access to 108 square foot of pasture. That's the marketing you hear. But the reality is you can raise those birds very closely to what you can in a conventional system. There's differences, yes, we give that, but not same as what a pasture poultry farm might be doing from an independent nature. And so you get this market that is claiming one thing, getting a premium for it, and not quite delivering what the consumers are expecting. And that's the challenge. That's the market. You want to talk about market welfare. That's a good term we might be able to use, right? It's competitive in the market, but when not everybody's thinking in the same terms, it creates an really kind of an awkward landscape to try to do business. And the challenge, of course, is most a regional or national egg brand can get retail shelf space at your grocery store in town. For me, where I'm at, Wise Markets would be one of those grocery stores, or Wegmans, right? Um, so when you are an independent farm and responsible for doing your own growing and marketing and selling and finding markets and lead development, all that good stuff, um, finding access to those same shelves is not as easy. It's really kind of hard. And so again, just walking through the challenge to get to where we're going. And um, where we're going is a whole lot of personality. There's a lot of ideals inside of the community, inside of pastured poultry. There's really not a one size fits all description. You can see again here more housing styles. I wanted to include lots of different housing styles and setups and environments in this presentation because there's some great pictures, but it also really, really shows how the model can be played out. You see we talked about predator defense here in the last talk. Here you can see a dog on the right and fencing on the left, two very good modes of predator protection. That fencing on the left is portable and electric. But this idea that in the beginning of APA, in the beginning of the pasture poultry movement, there's really this widespread rejection of the prescriptive definitions and standards. Like people just want to be told what it was they were doing and how they should do it. Um, and there was absolutely no tolerance for USDA run programs like the National Organic Program. And there's still not any tolerance for that, right? There's no real appetite by any significant amount of people to have a pasture raised be regulated in the way that organic is. Um, so that creates some ambiguity in terms of how people can raise pasture raised and claim it. Um, and that's fine, right? We'd rather have the competition of ideas than the competition of regulation. And so one of those key ideas in pastured poultry is really this idea of personal relationships. People an appeal, a very strong appeal to anyone who starts up a pastured poultry operation, like an independent person who switches careers or diversifies something else on another farm. They can start it up and they can have direct access to a consumer. The end consumer can have direct access to the farm. You build those relationships, and it's very easy then in that environment to kind of talk to everybody about why you're doing it, what you're doing, and you can see the results, you can see the great chicken, and people are buying into more than just a pastured chicken or an egg or we come up to Thanksgiving. Um, they're really buying into that whole relationship with between the farm and the consumer. And so that's critically important to this idea of pasture raised that APA advocates for. It's very hard that part's hard to replicate as soon as you start moving to like an integrator model with contract growers, right? You lose that piece of it when consumers only get their pasture raised from a retail shelf in the grocery store. You lose that personal connection. Um, not there's room for both. There's room for all of that, but I'm just saying that's where we began. That's kind of, and that's still the prevalent mindset within APA and within the farmers that we deal with on a daily basis, and that's the market. And so all of this brings us then to the culmination of where we are today, and it's 2024. American Grass Fed Association just had their annual conference last week, and they just announced formally that they were ready to start taking farms for certification, and uh, and they'll work through that certification process. Um, there's not many. Um, so yeah, so they'll work through that certification process with folks. And here are the kind of the highlights of this. So we're rolling with the idea that birds must spend their life on pasture, a majority of their life on pasture. So if you're a meat bird, that means 51% of your life, right? From the time they're born to the time they go to slaughter are going to be on pasture. Um, and brooding is where we want that confinement to happen, right? Because it's too easy to say, oh, well, you just confine them anytime you want for weather. And the reality is that's a that's an opportunity to really uh, negatively follow the standards. You compromise in those points. Um, Dr. Rothrock mentioned planting low spots in your field, and rain events happen and weather happens, and we'd rather have people you know put supplemental bedding down into their shelter to give the birds the protection they needed, and design shelters that are applicable to their climate and the species that they're raising. Those are more important. Those are the most important parts of that. So confinement happens in brooding when the chicks are the most vulnerable, that 0 to 3 weeks for meat bird kind of thing, and maybe a little longer for layers. And then layers themselves, need to be um, on pasture for majority of the grazing season for um, for the area you're in. And so they can be confined in for the few months in winter if you're in a cold climate, providing some supplemental feed stuffs, forages or something to give them some opportunity to forage around through the winter. And then the big one, pastures shall be covered in vegetation. This is one of the great challenges of a lot of organic free range over the years has been the idea of covered porches being suitable outdoor access. Pasture community doesn't have any tolerance for that. If you're pasture raised, you need to be on something that has vegetation. Um, and 50% here, this is one of those numbers. Anytime you quantify, anytime you put a minimum level of compliance, you're going to have people who don't like it. So people are not going to they don't always agree with this idea of 50%, but it's just a reality that pasture quality does vary from farm to farm, from region to region, from season to season, and even the type of pasture you put your birds on, whether it might be a silvo pasture or a full pasture. There's a lot of variance here, and so the idea here is the intent more so than the prescription. And as I mentioned previously, it does allow for a broad range of systems to be employed. You can see some options here. If we start in the left side, top left, that's Bruce, one of our board members. He's got his layer flock out there. His house is that white part right to the left. Um, you have these turkeys. You're not seeing their house, but their house is basically a roosting structure on running gear. So they're up off of the ground. Um, if you go another, not pictured here really, but another common layer shelter also built on running gear would have like a floor, like the ones I showed earlier, the one on running gear, the blue and white ones that I showed from the mobile chicken house. They have uh, plastic slatted floors. So my point here is people get hung up all the time on this idea of floor or floorless, or am I confined? Am I allowed to range? And some of that's preference, some of that's system, some of it's type of bird. Um, none of those things really um, define or limit the welfare of the birds. They all have maybe some slightly different ways to manage it, but you can see the the right side, top right there is a couple hoop house shelters or smaller bird shelters. And I really like pictures like this from overhead. You can see the the trail of impact there behind the birds, and so that's only 3, 4, 5 days removed. If that picture, if I included it and zoomed it out, to last week, to 14 days or whatever, you would see the vegetation recovering, and you would see it, going the other way. And so that grass is getting fertilized, it's getting a little bit of impact, but it's going to recover and regrow and be lush and be ready for the next batch of birds, or in that farmer's case, for cutting hay. Um, Down here in the bottom, you see some uh, meat birds ranging, like they're actually ranging. These shelters are fairly minimal. It looks like I'm not familiar with all the details of that farm, but that's, you know, obviously appropriate for that time of year in that setting. So there's lots of different options when we come to this idea of shelters. And so APA wanted to take this really intentionally different approach. And when we talked to American Grass Fed, to AGA, we wanted to really focus on what makes pasture poultry different in the context that APA members and really the context of what founded the community that we currently know as pasture raised. What makes it different? And so, because there certainly are other pasture raised certifications that are out there. I list them here. There's ones that simply say you have access to 108 square feet per hen. That's great. You know, go for it. But what we know is a lot of times birds don't adequately use that space, and you get heavy impact to the point where there's not a lot of vegetation left immediately outside that barn. You have other like AWA is going to put breed restrictions and sourcing restrictions. GAP, they have these multiple step programs and growth rate restrictions, and but they actually go a step further, and this is probably the result of politicking back at some point in time with someone with another company or so, I would imagine. This idea that movable pens without floors um, that confine the chickens and allow them to range within the unit can only achieve step two, which our members, our community would categorically reject that categorization. So there's really hasn't been one of these third party voluntary standards that APA has really ever felt comfortable with or would endorse. And so that's part of what gets us to the standard with AGA that we've written. And of course, USDA's label guidance. So the radical idea that they came out with here in um, is that they now published an update that said to claim pasture raised on your label, you need to verify that your land is rooted in vegetative cover for the majority of the lifespan of the bird, which is a shift from where they were in 2019, 2020 when they said, yes, it is synonymous. Um, Last year in 23, Purdue Farms submitted a petition to FSIS, petition 2303, that actually presented market research that showed that the current label claims were misleading consumers and argued for a differentiation of pasture raised. The APA supported that petition. We agreed that it needed to be a separate definition. Um, so in 2024, FSIS changes their mind and says, no, they are not different. And um, you can see what they say, vegetative cover, majority of life, um, which are big steps, a step at least anyway. And they did not codify the the definition, right? And so they took comments on this 2024 update through through Monday, through so just a couple of days ago, the comment period closed. And this picture here, I have it in here because this is a friend. I go to his place frequently. These are not organic chickens in this house. You can kind of just see the corner of the house here, but this is looking down his chicken yard. A few years ago, he did have certified organic chickens in here, and these were that was his outdoor access. And I can safely assume or say that I've never seen one of his chickens in one of those yards. So, more just beating on the idea of the challenges, right? Um, and so this idea that the definition was not codified, to come back to that for a moment, because we very much do not want a definition to be codified, but we do appreciate that FSIS is making an attempt to create a space inside this market that says pasture raised is different. And I think that's the most important thing we get out of the FSIS label update is simply an acknowledgement that there is a difference. And if you think about the difference, this is what it is. Now, what that means in practice, we don't really know. Will it change anything? We don't really know. The same people who are willing to kind of push the boundaries, we'll say, of existing pasture raised ideas, you know, how hard will it be for them to convince FSIS that they're still raising FS or raising pasture raised? So we don't know those things, right? But what we do have is a very clear um, kind of landscape developing within this label guidelines and really certification standard um, idea that standards always gives people a pause, like you always it just sets that connotation. There's a connotation about standards that I don't always like, but really it's a certification that you volunteer to do that says you're raising poultry in a way that that particular certification wants you to. And so, in my bias, this is how I build this pyramid. At the top, you have that direct relationship. Nothing will ever come between that direct relationship and a label claim. And you can see that the in poultry specifically, there's lots of local direct relationships that play out all across this country, and they're not all pasture raised, right? So that direct relationship really trumps anything else you find at the bottom of this pyramid. Then we move down the mobile idea of pasture raised. This is the AGA pasture poultry standard. It's the one APA recommends. We have our existing certifications, and we have our USDA labeling guidelines, which really doesn't have any teeth, but view it as an affidavit kind of thing. So this is the marketplace that we end up with. I think it's good in that it's differentiated, and we can compete in the market on ideas and still allows for lots of innovation to happen. And that is my last slide.
Thank you, Mike. I'll start with some of the questions that have been posted on the Q&A box.
Yes.
So one of the question was, uh, people support independent growers and such, but the concern is about food safety. And the question was, how many of these pasture laying hens are registered with the FDA to comply with the egg safety rule? Is it based on the number of the birds that you house in your farm, or if you have any other insights?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is, going back to Dr. Rothrock's study, we get an indication that the pasture model here necessarily isn't necessarily having a negative impact on the food safety aspect of it in his salmonella and Campy trials. And so I find that very encouraging. And Mike had published some data with APA back when he first ran those trials. And so it's very, very encouraging. In terms of registering the the flocks with FDA, so I'm sure commenter might realize that or understand if there's a 3,000 bird exemption at FDA level, 3,000 birds per farm. States can manipulate that exemption, and so you don't have to do any of those FDA testing protocols until you hit that 3,000 bird mark. We do have some farms that are at that level. Um, our largest pastured layer flock that I can think of that fits into the context of the mobile systems that I'm talking about today is right around, I think, 15 to 20. He's been as high as 30 or 35,000. So he obviously does those testing. So it depends on flock size, and state you're in, but most people will kind of stay under that 3,000 flock limit.
And then there is another question. So you mentioned some of the third-party certification organizations, which you said the APA probably hasn't endorsed any single one of them. So the question was, who is the contact to become certified? And I was just going to add to that question a little bit. So with the new standards that AGA has come about, so is the plan that APA is going to be acting as one of those certification organization, or please, if you have any insights on those.
Yeah, so I'll flesh that out a little bit more. So we don't first the really short backstory. We don't have the manpower, the resources, if you will, to be a certifying agency. And as an organization, we don't really have that mentality to be a certifying agency. However, we have, I would say, probably a significant number. That number is probably somewhere 20 to percent or so who would really want a pasture raised certification inside of our membership. And so we worked closely with American Grass Fed Association to create the standard that they are releasing. And so they're going to administer the standard. And so if you want to be pasture raised certified through AGA, American Grass Fed Association, that you can contact them directly. Um, the only stipulation that they'll have from our standpoint is that you meet the criteria of the certification and be a member of APA, of our association. They don't think that, and I mean, let's be honest, we helped write it, so we put this in there, but we don't believe that you should be a certified pasture poultry farm and not be a member of APA. if you're going to be raising it to the standards that are in that guideline. So those are really it. AmericanGrassfed.org will get you there to the standards, and you'll be able to contact their team and get set up. They use auditors throughout the country, a network. It's really one of the really cool standards. I think it's really affordable. Um, it is based on number of animals, self-reported number of animals in a year, but and they use local inspectors as much as possible and auditors, usually through like NCRS and maybe veterinarian offices and things like that to go out and do the audits and stuff. And so it keeps the program really, really within range and affordable for people.
Yeah, and then I just had a small follow-up question to that. So with what percentage of pasta growers in the United States do you think are associated with APA currently?
Oh my goodness, not enough of them. Um, so so one thing, and I didn't try to beat on this, but the people inside of the pasture raised growers are really independent minded people at this point, you know, and it's changing a little bit, but there's still a very independent streak that runs through our ranks. And so there's a sense that, you know, I know what I'm doing and I just do it. But so and the decentralized nature kind of makes it really hard to figure out exactly how many of those farms there are. So, and how many of those farms are actually engaged in some kind of business model versus just raising some birds for themselves and their neighbor. Um, so not enough, but we have about 1,100 active farms right now.
Okay, thanks. And then I'm going to read one question from the Q&A box. This question is from someone who is thinking about getting into cage-free egg-laying business. It's a long question, but I'll try to summarize it a little bit. The person is asking, uh, what what are some of the common misconceptions around pasture poultry businesses that you think that people have in terms of rearing and throughout the inter value chain? And then, what critical aspects of this business would you like the newcomer to understand and not underestimate while going into that pasture poultry rearing business?
So I think some of the critical aspects to think about and consider is this is still a business. Um, this is it's not easy. You know, I think in the outside world, you might look into pasture raised and say, wow, look at those price premiums. But a pasture raised farm's paying, an independent farmer. And I use the word independent here to mean like you're not growing under contract. You're responsible for the whole thing from brooder to getting that on somebody's plate. The whole chain. It's your responsibility. That's a daunting task for many, many farmers who just, you have to learn those skill sets. You have to learn how to market. You have to learn how to do all the sourcing of your feed and animals and stuff. And you have to, quite honestly, you have to be your own service tech, right? You don't have too many people that you can call to go out and say, my my flock has this problem. What might be the issue? That's a large part in where APA fills a big part of that gap is that community of resources and shared knowledge. But it's still the critical perspective. It's a hard business. There's still you have to be aware of margins. It's still based on it still works on scale. Scale might be differently applied than what commercial industry. Um, yeah, so it takes a lot of work.
Thank you. And then there is one last question. Uh, so, so is there any thing that APA or some regulatory organizations are doing to companies that are maybe misleading consumers about like not being actually pasture raised and then advertising their product as pasture raised?
Um, Not really that I'm aware of. I can think of a scenario a couple years ago where one of our members was trying to get pasture raised approved on his label. He owned an own U.S. inspected slaughter facility, was doing his own birds and wanted to get the pasture raised claimed on his label, and it was denied through the labeling authority he was working through because the labeling authority thought that he had to have his birds on the pasture from day one through slaughter instead of, but he brooded them obviously inside of a barn, and that was a disqualification for that perspective. So it's been kind of challenging, in the labeling space, but I don't know of anything federally that's happening. This is probably the petition by Purdue, who has an interest in that petition for sure, um, to separate the definitions between free range and pasture raised. That's probably the first time that's really been on the radar of a lot of people.